As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So the Washington Post reported on Wednesday that the Biden administration has secretly approved more than 100 separate foreign military sales to Israel since October 7th to support the mass killing of Palestinians in Gaza. And we don't know how these sales are being funded. The U.S. does provide Israel with $3.8 billion in military aid each year, and $3.3 billion of that is what they call foreign military financing, and that is money that the U.S. gives to foreign governments to purchase American weapons. So, again, there's been over 100 sales here, and only 2 have been made public. One for $106 million in tank ammunition, and one for $147 million in components needed to make 155 millimeter artillery rounds. And these became public because the Biden administration bypassed Congress to push them through. If you remember, I covered both of those deals. And U.S. officials told the Washington Post that there was no public debate for the other 100 deals because the dollar value fell under the threshold needed to inform Congress. So it looks like they are doing a bunch of these little arms sales, so there's no oversight, so it doesn't need to be made public, so they can just do it quietly and secretly. Something I've been saying for a while is discussing how the U.S. has not been transparent at all about what they're sending Israel, about how this is being paid for. But yet they're shipping all these weapons. The Pentagon was saying at one point they were shipping weapons on a near daily basis to Israel. And this explains some of it, I think, that they're doing just these little sales that they could probably do quickly just to keep it out of the public eye, as Biden is coming under pressure for supporting this genocidal campaign in Gaza. And the report said that U.S. officials told Congress during a classified briefing that the hundreds of sales amounted to thousands of precision-guided munitions, small-diameter bombs, bunker busters, small arms, and other types of lethal aid, what they call lethal aid, which means aid that can kill people. So the exact number of bombs and other types of equipment that the U.S. has delivered to Israel since October 7th is not clear. The Wall Street Journal reported on December 1st that the U.S. had provided Israel with 57,000 artillery shells and 15,000 bombs, including massive bunker busters, but that figure must be much higher at this point since that was published over 3 months ago. And this revelation about these 100 arms sales that the U.S. has approved for Israel, it comes as the Biden administration claims that it's pressuring Israel to allow more aid into Gaza, where children are starving to death and a major famine is imminent if it's not happening already. But the U.S. is not using its leverage over Israel. They're not threatening to cut off military aid. They're still providing this unconditional aid. So Russian forces have been making steady gains in eastern Ukraine since taking the strategic Donetsk city of Avdiivka last month, as Ukraine's war effort continues to falter. According to Russian Defense Ministry estimates, it took Russian troops 4 months to advance 5.6 miles through Donetsk before taking Avdiivka. In the last 3 weeks, Russian forces have already advanced 3 miles west of the city, and this was expected after they took Avdiivka, because it was a very key strategic city for Ukraine, the center of their war effort going back to 2014 when the Donbass war broke out. And they've been able to keep up, the Russians have been able to keep up the momentum. They're also starting to take out Abrams tanks. The U.S. made Abrams tanks. The U.S. has shipped 31 to Ukraine. Russia has said so far they've taken out 3 of those tanks. Despite the bleak situation, we know that Ukrainian soldiers on the front line are facing serious manpower and weapon shortages. It's a horrible situation for them. Ukraine's new ground forces commander, Oleksandr Pavlyuk, insisted that Ukrainian forces will be able to stabilize the situation and eventually go on a new counteroffensive. But we'll see. I mean, right now it's just looking really bad for the Ukrainian troops on the ground who are fighting. So on Tuesday, Texas Republican primary voters overwhelmingly supported a proposition in favor of legislation to restrict the deployment of the state's National Guard to combat zones. The proposition stated, quote, "The Texas legislature should prohibit the deployment of the Texas National Guard to a foreign conflict unless Congress first formally declares war," end quote. In response, 84% of Texas voters in this Republican primary voted yes, and only 16% voted no. I have the tweet in here from Bring Our Troops Home, which is the organization behind Defend the Guard, because that's what this proposition is based on, is the Defend the Guard legislation that if passed by a state, it would prohibit the state's National Guard from deployment to combat zones that were not without a declaration of war from Congress. And this was over 2 million people that voted in this proposition, and about 1.8 million people voted in favor of it. So this is a really good result. This is something that these guys can use to show all of these legislature, all of the state senators, state representatives, to show them, hey, you see, Republican voters want this. And I would be curious to see how this would have, for some reason, the propositions weren't on the Democratic primary either. I bet, even though this Defend the Guard Act has been overwhelmingly supported by Republican state senators and stuff, and the Democrats have mostly voted against it, I bet if you put it to Democratic voters, pose that question, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think they would probably favor this idea too. So, it's a good sign. And hopefully this gives them more ammunition to get this legislation passed in more places.
Is this the $2 billion bridge to Crimea, which looks like it's one of the wonders of the world?
Yes, I've been across it 3 times. I think it actually costs more than $2 billion. But yeah, it's a very big bridge.
But it's a civilian target. It's not. They're not talking about bombing a military base. This would be an act of war, would it not?
Well, it's going to be an act of war, whether it's a civilian target or a military target. It's an act of war. If it's a purely civilian target, it becomes an act of terrorism. One can make the argument that this bridge, because military trucks cross the bridge, military equipment on trains crosses the bridge, that it could be a military target. But you're missing the point here, because people are saying if Russia's bombing Ukraine, then Ukraine has every right to strike Russia. But they're missing the big picture. This is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. This is a war between Russia and the collective West. Ukraine, all of its logistics, its planning, its intelligence, the training, everything takes place on European soil outside of the reach of the Russian military. And so if people want to say, well, Germany is simply empowering Ukraine to strike deep into Russia. First of all, it's not that deep. It's Crimea. It's a civilian bridge. But if you want to play that game, then what you're saying is this war has changed. Now Russia gets to strike all the targets in Europe that will level that playing field. This is very much an uneven playing field right now. Russia is actually fighting this war with a hand tied behind its back, because all of the things that it would normally be able to do to disrupt logistics, which is one of the most important aspects of the war, it can't do, because all the logistics is taking place on protected soil. Poland, Germany, France, Netherlands. That's places that Russia can't touch. Ukraine has a safe haven. In the Vietnam War, we talked about, how the North Vietnamese could go back to safe havens, and how this, made it very difficult for the United States to prevail in this conflict. Russia's facing a similar problem right now. And if Germany's there, if the logic is, no, you can bomb that bridge because Russia gets to bomb targets in Ukraine, you're missing the bigger picture.
Understood. Is there any question that NATO, the United States, France, Russia, Great Britain are waging war against Russia?
First of all, I would have to say that NATO isn't at this juncture. What I would say is that there are nations who are NATO members who are active participants in this conflict. And I would list Poland, I would list Great Britain, I would list France, I would list Germany, and I would list the United States at a minimum, because we have troops on the ground who are actively involved in things, whether it be targeting or logistics or command and control, that are legitimate, targets from a military perspective. So we have people on the ground in Ukraine doing things that makes them a legitimate target, but we're doing it unilaterally. We're not doing it part of a NATO collective. This is a unilateral effort. And so far, we've kept large conventional units out of the mix. That would sort of be a red line. We have advisors, however we define them, whether they be active duty or sheep dip. That's where you take an active duty person and you sign some paperwork and they become a CIA contractor, things of that nature.
Right.
We have people work in air defense. We have people working the sensitive systems, HIMARS targeting, etc. We know that the British Special Air Service is there. The Special Boat Service is there. The French have sent commando units there. We have our own special forces on the ground in Ukraine. So we already have military forces deployed to Ukraine, but we haven't gone in as a NATO entity saying, here is NATO forces, a brigade, a division, a corps coming in. That would prompt a direct military conflict.
You began the conversation quite profoundly and quite accurately, I think, by saying that what the German generals were talking about is an act of war. It is no less an act of war, I would argue, for the United States to show Ukrainians how to pick a target inside Russia. It is no less an act of war for the British Special Forces to plan and plot how to blow up that bridge, and the same thing for the Poles and the French.
100%. And again, we need to understand the following. If it weren't for the intelligence support provided by the United States, Great Britain, France, and others, Ukraine wouldn't be able to accomplish any of the impressive results that they have, sinking Russian ships, damaging Russian ships, striking Russian air bases, because to take, it's not just about slapping a scalp missile or Storm Shadow under a Su-24 and going off and launching it. There's downlinks that are taking place. We're running reconnaissance missions with drones, with satellites, etc., picking up the Russian air defense radars that creates an overlay showing the links, the gaps that can be shot. That's shot downlinked to the airplane that the Ukrainian pilot's flying, and he's able then to load this into a targeting profile for the missile that he fires with the most up-to-date stuff that allows that missile to work its way through. This is why they're succeeding. If the Ukrainians didn't have this, they wouldn't have any of these successes. So it is an active war. We are active participants in the processes that allow the Ukrainians to strike Russian targets.
And no general government legislative body in any of these countries, United States, France, Germany, Great Britain, I don't know about Poland, but I'm going to ask you, has authorized those countries to deploy military assets against Russia.
Well, what I would say is that no legislative body has done it overtly. I know that the United States, for instance, we have presidential findings. So the president can sign a finding authorizing certain things to take place. You report these to the Gang of Eight, which are, the 8 most powerful members of the
That's the Congress within the Congress that meets in secret and can't repeat to other members of Congress what they're told.
Right. So that's not really democracy taking place. The Prime Minister has the ability to do things with the Special Air Service that avoids parliamentary scrutiny. And I believe the French have similar things. So what we're seeing here is these nations that are ostensible, democracies are using mechanisms within their system which are undemocratic in principle and reality, and using it to bypass the kind of scrutiny that normally would take place before you send a nation to war. And I just want to remind people, if Germany ever did facilitate the use of Taurus missiles to take down the Kerch Bridge, that's an act of war that Russia would retaliate. That retaliation would more than likely lead to a direct conflict between NATO and the United States, which would lead to a general nuclear war, and then we all die. That's the stakes here. This isn't a game. We've allowed Germany and France, the Germans with their Taurus missile, France talking about sending troops over to hijack the national security of the United States. We are on a path towards a war that will be global ending, and we don't have Congress talking about it. We don't have the president being honest with the American people. We're pretending that it isn't happening, but it is happening.
To state 2 other variables at the $10, $20, $40, $50,000 a year. Forget buying a house. Just going on dates can feel very intimidating when you realize, oh, this is not a pathway to marriage because I couldn't possibly afford that. And downhill from all of these decisions, in my opinion, is the fact that when you have inflation and you can't easily save money and see it, continue to grow, people do make more compulsive decisions. And so they do end up living with multiple roommates, buying the avocado toast, buying expensive coffee, taking vacations for Instagram pictures, and having pricey gym memberships because all of the other things, like just saving up to go buy a house, it doesn't seem that easy to do. Because what do you got to do? You got to figure out where to be in the stock market. You got to figure out the taxes on CDs. You got to try, the amount of things you have to try and figure out just to preserve your wealth to feel like there's something worth investing for, especially as a young kid without that much. Think about it. If you're coming out of college and you're not financially savvy and you're working a construction job and you're actually making good money. Let's say you're making $25, $30 an hour. Like you've actually, you've got a skilled job and you're making money. Think about what you have to do to try and be slick about actually saving that money to potentially go and buy a house.
Yeah, no, that's right. And think about if you're not savvy like that, but you are you're working hard and you're making something, whatever it is. Yeah. Say $30 an hour or something like that, or $40 an hour, and you're working hard. And then the price of everything shoots up the way it has in the last 4 years. And that buries you. And so why is it? And look, for someone like Bill Maher, who's been, I don't know, a millionaire since the 90s, to just go, oh no, it's these kids, they've got it better than ever. It's I don't think you have any idea. I don't think you have any idea what it is actually like for people out there today. And it's just not, you know what I mean? It's just not, that's not right. And you're right about that it does, all of the stuff that we talk about all the time, all of the kind of government interventions, whether it's the Federal Reserve or the income tax or just the rest of it, it does really disincentivize people from doing the right things. It makes it much harder. And anyway, I just thought it's a crazy conversation. It's another one like we played before where Bill Maher's in this moment where he's trying to argue these kind of liberal progressive values against someone who's just responding with common sense. They're just going, the other one was just have you bought eggs recently? And he's like, what about the price of a house? I mean, by the way, that's not even, when I said the average price of a house, it's oh, now go make that in a city. It's insane.
Also, another variable, I'm going to just call it government chaos, which is I graduated from college during the, I think I must have graduated in 08, 09, like heart of the financial, the last recession. And what I could tell you is I was not a particularly good student, but in other climates when companies are just hiring and looking for bodies, I'm sure I would have just had some dumb job at some financial firm or something. My career, and it's in part because of my decision to pursue stand-up comedy, but between the ages of like 24 and moving back home and then not having those first jobs out of college, I probably didn't have my first office job until I was age 30 when the economy was kind of hot again and they're just putting, bodies in. Now look at a decade later from what I went through in 08, kids are graduating college during COVID. And you're not really getting hired in the same capacity because you're doing a work from home job. You're not getting job training in the same way. So what I'm trying to point out is that the government chaos in the system and the way that we kind of have centralized government now will, and also even just factor in, your student loans because of the money that government has made available to colleges to increase those costs. What I'm trying to say is all of these are government variables that will hinder your ability to feel like you're on a path of growth early in your career to make decisions like, oh, I want to be getting married at age 25, 26, or I want to be forward looking and saving and building my career.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And that's a big deal. And then it's like, how do you put a price on that exactly? Like how exactly do you say to some young person that it's like, yes, you've been put in a situation where you can't be put on a path, and forget even getting married and having a family. Cause I know I'm like, I understand that I am to some degree injecting my subjective values into that equation. But how about just being put on a path to being independent? Because I think that's something that people like, that really is an integral part of what it is to be a man. And that's something that's robbed from so many people. And it's not because of anything they did wrong. It's because of the system that they inherit. And to have, it's so funny, man, because there is something where I do have this level of contempt for the baby boomer generation that Bill Maher is a part of. And I don't get me wrong, I'm not being a collectivist about this. There's lots of baby boomers who I love. I love my mother, and I love my in-laws, and I love a lot of baby boomers. But there's something that it's so easy for people of that age, people in their 60s or whatever, to just go like, oh, you guys, you know what I mean? Like, oh, you take it so for granted. Look at all the toys that you have that we didn't have, and you're going to complain about what we did. And it's like, hey, look, you guys, at least through the policies of the politicians that you voted for, created a situation where it's impossible for your children's generation to own anything. And then you look at them like they're the brats or something like that. I just find that so awful.
Just to speak to two examples of that, because they wrote the greatest wealth expansion in human history, but there's two variables at play there. One is, like a teacher who was working, let's say 70 years ago in the New York City police, any New York City job for that matter, they're like that first tier of pensions. So yeah, you guys are the beneficiaries of the Ponzi scheme you created because you're the first generation of people who got the best retirement benefits. That changes your entire life planning. Or I know my grandfather, for example, said that he had a couple real estate investments that if it wasn't for inflation, he would have lost a lot of money, but he was basically bailed out by inflation. So that's another one. How many of you guys literally rode the wave of the money that you guys facilitated the printing of, that you owned assets that went up in value, that changed the retirement and the ability of the lives that you guys lived for all of us to basically inherit that inflation?
The Peter Schiff Show.
All right, so I want to talk about the Powell's semi-annual testimony today at the House. And, before he delivered his prepared remarks and took questions from the congressman, a couple of them spoke, the chairman of the committee, the ranking minority member, and that's Maxine Waters. And I want to point out something that she said, because in her little talk, she brought up housing. And she said that housing is a main driver of inflation, that rising housing costs are the reason for inflation, a main driver. And, of course, that's not true. Housing isn't driving anything. Housing's just going along for the ride. The driver is Maxine Waters, right? And her buddies in Congress. They're driving the inflation bus, not housing. Housing's just riding in the bus along with everything else. The driver of inflation is deficit spending and then the money that the Federal Reserve prints to monetize that debt. That is what drives inflation. Everything else is just dragged along. So Maxine Waters has got it wrong. Instead of chastising Powell because somehow he's not paying attention to housing as if, there's something he could do. She should be looking in the mirror. She's the reason that the price of housing and rents and everything else are going up. But also, to make matters worse, there's a lot of regulations coming out of government, and not all of it from the federal government, a lot of it from state and local governments, that unnecessarily makes housing more expensive. Whether it's making rents higher than they should be, or maintenance costs, or taxes, or insurance. But a lot of stuff costs more because government regulation is interfering in the market. So the reason that people are struggling with housing prices is government-created inflation and government regulation. And a lot of it is coming from the House, where Maxine Waters has been a member for I don't know how long, but for quite some time. But anyway, so when Powell speaks, he again talks about how good the economy is. The economy is great. The labor market is strong. We've avoided recession. And in fact, all the Democrats, of course, use their time as an opportunity to talk about how great the economy is and give the credit to Biden and Powell. But then the Republicans come in and they try to point out that the economy isn't good and we have a lot of inflation, and they blame that on Biden. But they overlook the fact that when Trump was in charge, they were running deficit spending too. A lot of the all the COVID stimulus started with Trump. It's just that when Biden came into town, he expanded on what Trump had already done. But it's not like the Republicans have clean hands here. And so it makes their criticism, disingenuous. And, some people might accept it, but for other people, it's harder. That's why I like being consistent. So I have credibility when I say something. I'm not just being a political opportunist and just trying to blame the other side of the aisle. I look at both sides as complicit, even though clearly, what Biden is doing now is even worse. But, there's a lot of optimism that, if Trump goes back to office, the inflation problem is going to go away. Well, nothing that Trump is talking about doing is going to solve the problem. And if he presides over a second term the way he presided over the first term, it's just going to get a lot worse because it's just more deficit spending. Right? That's what he did before. Maybe he'll change. We'll see. But what Powell was saying about inflation at the beginning was incorrect, because he is claiming that inflation is pretty much down, and he just wants to make sure it stays down. Even if Powell was right about inflation coming down, which he's not, if it did come down and then we substantially reduced rates, it would go right back up again. And that is what gold is telling you. If gold is telling you that rates are too low, how do you lower them in the face of that? Those are the mistakes that were made in the 1970s before Paul Volcker came into office and finally did the right thing. We're still doing the wrong thing under Powell. And what he is indicating he's going to do is extremely dangerous. And now the dollar was down, a decent amount today, I think 0.5%. Still, well north of 100, around 103. But the dollar, again, to me, looks like it's rolling over. Because where are the central banks getting all the money to buy this gold? It's dollars. They're using their dollars to pay for the gold. I mean, the whole purpose of buying gold is to get out of dollars. That's what they want to do. But you can't get out of dollars without getting into something else. And so why get into euros? Why get into yen? Why take that chance? Buy gold. That's your safest bet. That's the only monetary asset that's not somebody else's liability. That's the only asset that you can't get sanctioned. As long as you have the gold, in your own custody, right? You're not leaving it at the Fed or something. You take delivery of the gold. You keep it within your own sovereign territory. I mean, no one can take it unless they physically invade you, right, and take your gold, right? And so this is what people are trying to do, and the Fed is completely ignoring it. Credit card debt is at a record high. Household debt is a record high. Government spending a record high. The rate hikes have done nothing. Too little, too late. The Fed has not bent the inflation curve at all. It doesn't matter that the numbers have come down from 9 to 3. It's not because of those rate hikes. And the numbers are going to go up. The only way the rate hikes affected the inflation rate is that the anticipation of rate hikes brought down commodity prices. But they're going back up. Oil got back almost to $80 again today, 79 and change. Look at the stock market, too. I mean, one of the ways that higher rates has typically brought down inflation was a reverse wealth effect. Higher rates bring down stock prices. They bring down housing prices. That doesn't happen. Housing prices are record highs. Stock prices are record highs. And the Fed is done hiking. I mean, normally, when the Fed is finished hiking, asset prices have come down, right? They start to go up when the Fed starts to cut. But they never went down when the Fed hiked. So how are you going to ignite an even bigger asset bubble by cutting rates when prices never even went down. So the rate hikes have done nothing to put that inflation genie back in the bottle.
I'll have to describe our philosophy. We're for less government, not more government.
That's right. That's right.
We're for sounder money, not more fiat.
That's right.
Less debt. A lot of things, but they don't even hardly talking about that.
Yeah.
You know, they just go on and on. Their technicalities. So we'll have to talk about some of the technicalities in foreign policy. This one, we've touched on this one, Yemen and that problem over there.
Yeah.
But this headline on the Cradle says the Pentagon blames the intel gap for failure to stop Yemen's Red Sea operation. Does that mean the Pentagon's confessing? You know, I don't think they do that very often. But at times, there's somebody comes along and admits, you know, most of the time it's a justification to get more of the same stuff and change it around. But anyway, the failure started the day we went in there, and we've been in there more than one day or 1 year. We've been messing around there for years, and it was bound to happen. And we had to deal with the Saudis and work all that out, and the whole mess over there. So everybody's surprised. Why do we have so much trouble? Oh, it's the Pentagon. They slipped up. There was one guy. We'll put him in jail, whoever messed up on the intelligence. But I would say the whole principle is not intelligent, and the activity they're doing is not intelligent. And when you get into who does what and why, you find out that some people are praised for doing the same thing and they get promoted, and other people go to prison, you know, under these circumstances. So this is a shame. But the Pentagon has to explain themselves. How did they mess up? How did they misjudge this? And what are they going to do about it? That is the spot. I'm not very optimistic that we're going to have a great answer by tomorrow morning, and we're going to move the troops out like we should.
Well, it's Operation Prosperity Guardian. We can put up this link. It's from the Cradle is the article. It's a good publication, definitely worth looking at. As you say, Dr. Paul, Pentagon blames intel gap for failure to stop Yemen's Red Sea operations. And just to backtrack a little bit, you know, we had October 7th, the Hamas attack, and then we had Israel's counterattack, and then all of a sudden we see that Israel is not just going after Hamas, Israel is basically flattening Gaza and killing 30,000 Palestinians. Well, Yemen didn't like that. The people in Yemen didn't like that. The leadership didn't like that. And so they said, okay, the Red Sea is closed to shipping going to and from Israel. We're going to close down the ports. This is a way that we are going to do what we think is right to protect people who are suffering a humanitarian catastrophe, which is pretty objectively the case. And so this is an example of the U.S. reaction. Oh yeah, well, we're going to start bombing you, which is exactly what the Biden administration did. They didn't go and ask them, okay, do we have a plan? Do we know everything we need to know? No, it just bombs away. And so what you have, and actually it's even worse than you're saying, Dr. Paul, because the Pentagon guy came before Congress and said, don't blame us, it was the CIA. They didn't give us any intelligence. We thought everything was going to be fine. And put up this next clip, this will tell you what they were saying. They said U.S. defense officials have blamed insufficient intelligence for Washington's abortive airstrike campaign against Yemen, which started mid-January and has so far failed to deter the Yemeni armed forces from attacking U.S., UK, and Israel-linked vessels in the Red Sea in support of Palestine. So initially it was only just about Israel-linked vessels, but then the U.S. and UK started bombing Yemen. They said, okay, we're going to mess with your vessels too. But it turns out, by starting this bombing, it's just an example of this sort of war should be the last resort, but with the U.S. government, it's always a first resort. So they started bombing, it's not working at all, and now they're saying, well, we just didn't know that much about them.
And then they open the door for questions. Did he do it on purpose? What serves their interest? Well, building more bombs, and showing how dangerous the world is. But the one result of this is something that is very predictable, and it says the Yemeni leaders maintain that no amount of hostilities will deter us from continuing their Red Sea expeditions.
Yeah. The Ukraine war and the Western system's fatal flaw. It's a very interesting article pointing out why the Ukraine, it talks about Ukraine's imminent capitulation to Russia. Ukraine will not win, Russia will win, and it's because of a fatal flaw in the system of how we approach the military and how we approach defense and paying for it in the U.S. and in the West in general.
Well, what caught my attention, and this is just a assessment by me. I can't prove anything, but we talked about Marco Rubio yesterday, and he had a different appeal. He really didn't think we could win the war from the beginning. I didn't understand his excuse for it, but it was insane. So that was the case. So I thought, well, there's two things there. Yesterday we talked about Rubio sort of throwing in the towel, and then we have these people come on and getting articles like this. And this is I think, enlightening, but it doesn't enlighten the right people. It just builds more determination on their part because, what we see is stupidity and why did they do that? And there's plenty of that to go around. But there's also, people that that's their policy and they hope they can get away with it, and they do get away with it, and they get their support from the media. And eventually, though, why in recent months now, I've become more optimistic because I think the alternative now, to the mainstream media has improved tremendously. It's still a mess. We've complained a lot about the social media and working with the government, but there's some social media that's not interested in working with the government. So and I think the technology is out there to try to wake people up to this, and that's when they're going to panic. Matter of fact, I think there's some of that panic going on right now because the opposition to the principles we stand for getting louder and louder.
Yes. Brian Berlev talks about many of the reasons why the combined West is now clearly losing the arms race, not only against Russia but also against China, is that while Russia's defense industry is purpose-driven, that of the West is profit-driven. And we know this because we see the revolving door between military officers and cushy jobs in the military-industrial complex. You double dip, you're a general, you get out, you get your massive pension, plus you make $500,000 or probably more a year working for Lockheed Martin, what have you. The whole system is corrupt because then you argue for more war. So war is a sort of self-perpetuating machine rather than how many missiles do we need to deter our enemies.
There's a market effect here because people are being rewarded for doing bad, building weapons and gouging the taxpayer. But they're very blunt about it. It says Western military-industrial complex is entirely structured around profit, like you say, profit objectives, which created a perverse system of incentives that rendered its output ineffective in more than one way or another.
Yeah.
So it's not even accomplishing it. Matter of fact, they claim this is making us safe and we're bringing about peace. The truth is, all this mischief is making us poorer and more vulnerable and less free. And people don't want to listen to that.
No.
But I want to correct that. There are a lot of people who do, but our numbers just aren't big enough yet.
But it's just like our friend Chuck Spinney said, and I know that he spoke at one of your lunches. I've known him for 25 years or so. He spent an entire career at the Pentagon saying just that. We spend a ton of money for stuff that doesn't work because the system is broken. And he got on the cover, I think, of Newsweek for doing it in the 80s, but it didn't fix the system. So here we are. I do want to say one last quote from the article because I really like this. I'm sure other people have read it. It's nothing new. But it's a quote from Napoleon Bonaparte. Maybe you saw this. If you can put that last one up. He says, as Napoleon Bonaparte put it, wars happen when your government tells you who the enemy is. Revolutions happen when you figure it out for yourself. So I thought that was kind of a clever statement.